Hey, all right, chapter 7. Here we go. I kept my fire burning night and day. I saw figures moving along the high bluff, but no one came. The nights grew colder. The wind shifted to the north and stayed there. Torrents of geese began to pour down from the north. A few stopped to rest on the island, but I had no way of catching them. I ate the last of the deer meat and half of my smoked fish. Still, no one came looking for me. I thought of making a raft out of logs, lashing them together with strips taken from my deerskin cape, but there was not enough leather to do this the right way. So then I thought of getting a log and drifting downstream until I reached land on one side or the other. I gave this idea up because the current was strong, and if I drifted south for no longer than a day, I would be deep in the country of our enemy, the marauding Sioux. The nights grew bitter cold. Cakes of ice floated past, and some piled up at the head of the island. A thin crust froze along the riverbank. It was possible that the whole river would freeze over. At least if it did that, then I could cross over to the far shore. It was too cold to sleep on the ground, in a hollow covered only by a blanket of leaves. I put up a lean-to of driftwood against the trunk of the largest of the cottonwoods, covered it with willow branches, and dug a deep pit for the fire close to the doorway. I caught another small string of fish and smoked them. But whatever I was doing, I stopped to scan the shores to the east and the west. At nightfall, I watched the evening star and spoke to her. Ice was growing thick along the banks. Cakes of ice floated past now in a steady stream. Some of them were half the size of my island. On one of the cakes were two deer. I watched them go past without feeling sad, for if they had piled up on shore, I had no way of killing them. It rained, and the rain turned to sleet. The sleet turned to snow. The sun came out in a stormy sky. Through the pale light, I saw on a cake of ice what I thought was a brown bear sitting on its haunches. As the ice floated closer, dipping from one side to the other under the beast's weight, I saw that it was not a bear, but a buffalo cow. The ice cake brushed the shore. It was dipping away back into the current when the beast plunged into the water, climbed the bank, and stood staring right at me. Buffalo are gentle beasts if they're not wounded. I stared back at her, and she moved away toward the far end of the island. It snowed in the night. When I got up to put wood on the fire and cook a fish for breakfast, I saw hoof marks in the snow. They made circles, many of them, around the hillocks. The cow had seen the cottonwoods and wanted to eat their bark, but was afraid to come closer. I broke off some of the cottonwood branches and went to find her. She stood by the pile of driftwood, trying to find bark she could eat among the barkless logs. I came close to her and held out the cottonwood branches. She moved away from me, so I left the food and went back to finish my breakfast. She was at the same place the next morning. I left food for her again, but after that, since it was a long walk in the icy air, each day I left food for her closer and closer to the hillock. Each day I tried to get her to eat from my hand, and always she backed away, though not as quickly, her head lowered and her yellow eyes fixed upon me without so much as a single blink. I got tired of her ways. I thought, what a fine warm robe you would make, and that big long tongue of yours, which you slurp up food with, would be very tasty roasted on the fire. I know it sounds kind of gross, but I've never eaten it, but I've heard that cow tongue is really delicious. It sounds gross though, right? I don't think I want to try it. Soon she began taking food from my hand, and each morning I found her at the door of my lean-to. The cottonwoods, the big grove of willows, and the thicket of prickly pears were nearby, but she much preferred that I feed her, and I liked it. She was good company. She kept me from just thinking about my dilemma that I was in. The river was frozen over now on both sides of the island, except for channels down the center. The channels were too wide to swim across. My food ran low. Thinking about it, I remembered the winter when food ran out and all the Shoshones had to eat was bark from the trees. Some people even ate their moccasins, though I never did. But now, from time to time, I feared that I might have to. One morning, after it had snowed all night, I went out to the west bank of the island. There was a white glare on the ice and the river that blinded me, but I was sure I saw a canoe coming toward me from the south against the current. And there were two people in the canoe, both of them paddling. I took off my cape and I waved it, fearing that in the icy glare they would miss me. The one in the back of the canoe raised his hand to let me know that he saw me. Then he turned toward the bank where I stood. A girl in the front of the canoe held out her paddle, and I grasped the end of it and pulled them in. The man got up, stretched himself, and stepped on shore. Huge, bigger than Leborn, but not tall. He was wrapped in a bearskin cape and wore a red fox cape with the fluffy tail dangling behind. I could see only his eyes, which were set close to his nose and looked like small dark pebbles. He made signs with his mittened hands. He asked me what tribe I belonged to, and when I pointed toward the village, he smiled. Metaharta? I nodded. He did not ask me why I was on an island in the middle of the river in the wintertime. I go there, he said in Minaturi. You want to come? Yes. Now? Now. Get in, he said, holding the canoe for me. The buffalo cow stood a short distance away, looking at us. The man asked the girl to hand him his fire stick. He put it to his shoulder. Fire came out the end, then smoke. When the smoke drifted away, the cow was lying on her side. With a sharp knife, he butchered the carcass and he gave the pieces to the girl, who put them in a neat pile. Sweating in the bitter cold, he pulled the robe away from his face. It was covered with hair, right up to his eyes. Never had I seen a man with a hairy face before. He did not belong to our people. Our people were without hair. If the smallest hair did appear, our men plucked it out with deer-bone tweezers. The man wiped his face on his arm and with the fire stick between his knees took up his paddle and started across the river. The girl was young. She paddled with the same stroke he used, as though they had traveled much together. Once she paused and turned to look at me. I smiled and she smiled back. It was not a friendly smile. I found out her name was Otter Woman. And that's the end of chapter 6.